Hello and welcome to the narrated version of Chapter 2 Notes. What is a play? All right, so a play is the basic unit of the theater. It's not a thing, it's an event. Like we said before, it's audience and actors getting together to tell a story. That is what we can call a play. So the event of a play is action surrounding a conflict. Conflict is an important part here. You wouldn't go to a football game and not expect conflict. If both teams are evenly matched, that's exciting because that's a big conflict. If one team is way better than the other team, that's not interesting to watch because there's no conflict. So conflict is really what we go to see, even if we don't want to admit that to ourselves. We can also say that a play refers to the literature itself, the actual script. Written plays have existed for about 2,500 years. Prior to that time, it was more just an oral tradition where things were handed down just verbally. But now, with the ancient Greeks, we started writing them down. So, understanding plays, there's two primary ways to understand plays that is talked about in your textbook. Genre, what type of play is it? And structure, what kind of a pattern does the action follow? So the genre is one thing, and then within that genre, there's going to be a structure. So let's talk a little bit about what those mean. So we classify plays according to genre. A play's genre is its type. Discerning a play's genre is subjective. Sometimes we might think something's a comedy when it's really a tragedy. Scholars and critics can still disagree on what constitutes a certain genre, but a lot of times we will agree on what a genre is. We can really break it down to two major genres, comedy and tragedy, and within that there can be an infinite other amount of genres, melodramas, histories, musicals, etc. You can have musicals that are tragedies, you can have musicals that are comedies. So you can see how things get jumbled up. And if you think about it, the Academy Awards has a really hard time sometimes putting movies into specific categories, so it's the same kind of thing. Let's talk about Aristotle. You may have heard of this guy, Greek philosopher. The first major classification was by Aristotle. We can attribute a lot of our storytelling techniques to him. He lived between 384 and 322 BC, a really long time ago. He wrote the Poetics in 335 BC, which a lot of artists use, not just theater artists, but a lot of different artists refer to this for their philosophies. He divided plays into comedies and tragedies, was one of the major things he did. This is considered the most influential work of theater criticism in Western history, the Poetics. The principles that he wrote down remain core building blocks in writing for theater and film as well. And if you study theater and film, you will hear of Aristotle. Okay, so he talked about tragedy. According to him, it centers on a great person, a protagonist who possesses a tragic flaw, which leads to reversal and self-recognition, and this great person undergoes a change in fortune. That was Aristotle's basic definition of a tragedy. It is going to end in death or demise, so it does not have a happy ending. That is one of the major things about a tragedy. If you see a film that has a happy ending, which a lot of films do, it's not a tragedy. Elicits emotions from the audience. The audience then purges these emotions. So the point of a tragedy, according to Aristotle, was to get the audience to feel something very, very intense and then have it released somehow in the death of the character, for example, or in the revelation of the news that is brought to them or something like that. The bad guy gets killed, that's kind of an emotional release. Or if the good guy gets killed, that's an emotional release as well. Then he talked about comedy. He said, this humorously addresses topical and timely situations. It depends on acute human observation. So rather than the broad stories and the large characters and the very important characters of the tragedies, comedies was a little bit more about everyday behaviors, the minute things we do that are absurd and silly. So great comedies can transcend their timeliness because humans have been doing silly things for a long time, and so there's a great way to capitalize on that. Shakespeare, for example, writes comedies about things that are still going on. The way that people fall in love. I mean, that really hasn't changed over millions of years. So great comedies, like I said, can transcend their timeliness. And comedy does not have the same historical reputation because, again, it's about smaller day-to-day things rather than large events in history. But some masterpieces, such as Molière, survive through the ages because they are a little bit more about things that were happening at the time. So let's talk about structure of a play. How the action of a play is structured is known as its dramaturgy. Two primary ways to analyze dramaturgy. You can talk about the vertical axis. What are the components of the play as you go up and down the scale? The horizontal axis is across time. What is the temporal experience of the play? So let's break that down and make more sense of it. The vertical axis, what are the components of a play? So Aristotle said you have to have at least 6 parts from most to least important. Plot is absolutely essential to the vertical axis component of a play. What is it about? Then the character. Who are these characters and what are they doing here? The theme. What is, in other words, we can say, what is the lesson of the play? Is it about, robbing is bad, or, stealing is not a good thing, or love is complicated? That might be the theme. What is the lesson? What can the audience take away from the play? Then the diction is a little bit more about the language itself, and we'll talk more about that in a second. The music and the spectacle. How is it put together exactly? So we can add a new component. Aristotle didn't specifically talk about this, but we can talk about convention. How is this done? Is it done through, videos? Is it done through electronic music? Is it done through live music? That's another way we can talk about it. So here's the 7 then that we can talk about. The plot is the structure of the action. What happens when? The character, the depth and the quality of the people, what are they like? The theme is the abstract intellectual content. What can we take away from the play and its meaning? The diction is the character of the text. For example, are they Southern people who speak with a dialect? Are they people who use contractions all the time? Or do they say, I will go to the store instead of I'll go to the store? Are they formal speakers or are they informal speakers? So the personality of the way they speak. The music, the orchestration of sonic palette. That doesn't just mean music as in music that we think of, but it can also be the patterns of our speech, the rhythms of our pauses and things like this. Playwrights think about this a lot when they pick words. They pick words based on how many syllables they have and how poetic they sound when people actually say them. We don't think about this in our everyday speech, but playwrights certainly think about what kind of a rhythm is going on. And certainly music can play into that as well. Are there musical transitions? Is there a beat to a fight scene? Something like that. Then there's the spectacle. What does it look like on the stage? Are there a lot of bright colors? Are there really big trees? What does that look like? And then convention. What are the rules between the audience and the performer? Are you going to go into the audience and tell part of the story? Are you only going to stay on the stage? Those kinds of things. All right, then we talk about the horizontal axis. Plays occur over time. They exist as a shared experience. They have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end. The time of a play is divided into 3 groupings. The PrePlay, which means anything that happens before the play starts, the play itself, and then the post-play. So let's talk about each of those. PrePlay is the transition into the world of the play. This may be something you haven't thought about before. How do you get the audience to the theater? That's a really important question that theater artists have to answer all the time. In historical times, before the internet and before TV advertisements, you had processions, they had flags, they had speeches, they might have a horn that blows that people know, oh, the play's starting, let's get to the theater. So they would march through the town and announce it and things like that. Today, of course, we have posters, we have billboards, we have advertisements. So that's part of the pre-play activity. How do you get people there? And then once you get them there, how do you get them focused on the story? Because they're coming from all these different directions. People might have had a flat tire on the way to the theater. People may have just broken up with their boyfriend on the way to the theater. So you don't know what kind of a mood they're going to be in when they get to the play. So what do? Do you have music playing that can help get them in the mood? The audience needs to come together as a group even before the play starts. Do you have cookies to sell? Do you have artwork around the theater that helps get them in the mood? So the pre-show draws them in, gets them there, and gets them in the mood to watch something that they can all watch together. So then the play itself begins. You have the exposition. We can break this down into 4 things. The exposition is the basic information that the audience needs to know about the play. So once the play starts, who are these people? Where are they? What's going on? We want them to know. We don't just start with the conflict because we would be confused what's going on. So we have to give some background information so the audience understands who these people are and what they're about. Then you can start building the conflict. This establishes the characters' decisions, their personalities, things that go wrong, things that get complex. And then there's a climax, the extreme point of conflict, when things just can't get any worse. That is the conflict, the climax, when the bad guy's standing on the cliff and you have a gun pointed at his head. And I mean, this doesn't usually happen in a play. That's more like a movie thing. But you know what I'm saying. It's a breaking point where things are finally going to resolve. Then you have what's called the denouement, is the French word for resolution. The resolution of the conflict that results in an understanding. So after everything has finally come forth, then you can say, okay, now what are we going to do about this problem that we have that we've tried to fix and all that kind of thing. Then after the play, there's an agreement between the audience and the performers. This technically is known as the curtain call. This is when we acknowledge the fact that what we've been watching is not real. And this is a very important part of it, especially if you're watching a tragedy or if you're watching something that ends very darkly. You want to make sure the audience isn't left in that world. You want to release them from that world. And so the actors come out on stage, they're basically saying, hey, guess what? This was just a story, just to remind you, don't worry. We're not really bad people up here. We're telling a story, and I appreciate you coming. And so it's the actor's way of acknowledging the audience. It's the audience's way of acknowledging the actors in this shared experience. So they bow to the applause. They recognize that this was a shared experience. And in historical times, in fact, they were actually bowing to the king to say, if you didn't like the show, you can cut my head off. I won't mind. You know, that's my job. We don't do that anymore, obviously. The audience continues the post-play outside the theater. They talk about it. Perhaps they've changed their minds about certain kinds of characters that they might have seen on stage. Their behavior could be affected by the play, depending on what they saw and what they took away from it. And this is known as dramatic criticism. And now the critics come out and they talk about the play and what its effect was. And we'll get more into that. The last slide I have here is non-Aristotelian events. Because, Aristotle wrote these rules 2,500 years ago, we kind of break them. We tend to break rules a lot. Many theater artists rebel against Aristotle with a lot of things. They use over-the-top imagery. They go even farther with some of those plots, some of those things. They have deliberate artificiality. Sometimes things are supposed to look fake, and there's a lot of reasons why that happens. Part of it is because if you don't want to get the audience really emotionally involved in order to make them think more logically about the play, that is one tactic. Alternative structures. You might have a play starting at the end of the story and going to the beginning. You might mess with time. You certainly have seen films that do this. Memento is a really good example of that. So Memento would have driven Aristotle crazy because he would have said, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to go out of order. But we like to rebel as artists, and so it makes it more interesting. So despite all of this, Aristotelian theater still remains the most prevalent. We're still used to seeing things in order. That tends to make the most sense for us. The best plays, though, can reinvent these rules while retaining the core principles: structured action, compelling characters, increasing tension. As long as you have those things, you can kind of play around with all those other elements. And Aristotle's dead, so he won't care. But as long as you have those main things, you're going to catch the audience's attention. And that's the end of this presentation.